Good morning.
Louise, you are an associate professor at the Danish School of Education at Aarhus University in Copenhagen, Louise Bøttcher. Very nice to meet you. But throughout your career, I noticed, looking back on your CV, from the very beginning, you've been focused on the development and education of people with very severe cerebral palsy. Could you explain to me how come your life has taken this direction? How come you have this focus on severe disability?
I think there was two different experiences that kind of mixed together. Once, as a psychology student, I had a great interest in neuropsychology, and we know that cerebral palsy is caused by a brain lesion. So compared to autism or some other diagnosis, here we got a clear biological origin to this disability. At the same time, I had a summer job at a specialized kindergarten for children with cerebral palsy. And it was a great summer, but also it became very clear that these children were they had so much in common with children without disability. Like they were so full of things they liked to do, they wanted to have fun, they wanted to play. So it was clear that just looking at them from a neuropsychological point of view was not enough. So it was these two interests that kind of got together, that I was interested in how far could neuropsychology explain the difference between all the children, what they could do and what they couldn't do. And at the same time, I needed something more to actually grasp what was going on. And that intrigued me. And I think it's that interest that still intrigues me.
Yeah, great. I noticed that you gave a keynote presentation quite recently at the Nordic Network of Disability Conference, and your address was entitled Outline of a Cultural Historical Model of Disability. Can you first tell me where and how you came to chat the cultural historical approach?
As I said, I was at first mainly interested in neuropsychology and dived very deeply into the neuropsychological aspects of cerebral palsy. At the same time, I felt that these children there were aspects of how they functioned, how they developed, how they were as persons that couldn't be grasped by neuropsychology. And I was at that time looking at critical psychology, which we had a professor at University of Copenhagen, Ole Dreyer, who was very much bringing forward critical psychology. And I was looking at, would it be possible to combine neuropsychology and critical psychology in some ways? I was not actually quite satisfied with it. It was difficult because critical psychology was not accommodating to neuropsychology. It was like more of opposing neuropsychology.
Yeah. It tends to, as it says, be critical, but in my view, that it doesn't develop very much of an alternative sort of approach, I find.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then I was at that time in the beginning of my PhD and at University of Copenhagen, and the institution moved to a different place. I got a new office, and I was sitting rather next to Marianne Hedegaard. So we began to talk while we were having lunch, and more she was bringing me into the cultural historical tradition and introducing me to Vygotsky. And when I read his defectology, it was just like a door that opened, because he had this rich conceptual framework that enabled me to do exactly what I would like to do, to bring the biological aspects of the disability from neuropsychology into an understanding of people as subjective beings with motives, embedded in social settings. And it was exactly what I was looking for. And it was just such a great revelation to come across this rich conceptual framework that actually existed. But I have never come across it in my master degree. It was only, I think, in my second year as a PhD student that suddenly this door opened.
Yeah, a very happy coincidence. Now,
Definitely.
I read in your work that you define Vygotsky's approach to understanding disability as an incongruence between the individual psychological structure and the structure of cultural norms. That's one of several ways that you express it. Could you explain to me what you mean by incongruence?
It is a word that as Vygotsky used the word, but not in many places. There's like one or two places in the defectology where he writes about this incongruence. But it's a very rich idea. The idea is that the social settings are very much accommodated for people for people with typical development. And for children with typical development, their development will almost automatically be supported as they participate in all the social settings. However, as soon as you divert from typical development, your development is not automatically supported because of this difference or mismatch between how social settings are organized and how you are able to participate. So this incongruence is a kind of a mismatch. And this is more like the abstract idea or the general idea. And what I have kind of pursued in my research is then to dive more deeply into specific instances of this mismatch and how it might increase the disability, or sometimes how you may overcome the mismatch and actually lessen the disability.
I understand. You've taken a very general idea and you've made it concrete. You're investigating specific circumstances, and you can see how the person is developing or failing to develop in that situation. I hear echoes of Marianne Hedegaard's work in that, really. Yeah. So we'll just spend a moment on that. You say that the centrality of motives, understanding development, was sort of central to what you got out of Marianne's work. Could you explain that a bit?
As I started my discussions with Marianne, she actually became my PhD supervisor. And she's always bringing motives forward. And thus I became interested in the concept as well. I think at the moment I was more interested in younger children in the beginning of school. And what this project showed using the concept of motive was exactly that motive was also part of why these children had difficulties learning. When you have children with a congenital brain damage, usually when they have problems learning, it's mainly understood of course, it's because their brain is not working in the way it should. But as you look closer into the social setting and brought this concept of motives to the setting, it became clear to me that part of the problem was also that the development of motives was kind of delayed in these children. They were children with very severe physical disabilities. So just exploring the world took longer time. And they were still preoccupied with exploring the world, playing. But now they were in a school setting where they were actually supposed to sit down and engage in learning activities. And they were not motivated for that at all. And that was also part of why they were not learning. They could not see the idea in the activity at all. They were not motivated for it. They were constantly trying to turn it into a fun game into something where they could explore what they could do with their bodies and in the world. So I think the motive concept is very good at bringing general psychology into understanding children with disability, because it's so often forgotten that they are also just children with all these normal developmental challenges that you so easily see in children without disability and are so easily forgotten as soon as we have children with severe disability.
So the Vygotskian concept of a social situation of development, which I'm obviously familiar with in the general context of Vygotsky's theory of child development, but I imagine it takes on a very particular form when you're dealing with a children whose development is taking a different road than what people around them expect. Could you explain how the social situation of development works out for a child with cerebral palsy?
You can say as soon as you have children or young people as well with moderate or severe disabilities, how much they develop is not only a matter of the biological potentials they have, but also on the social settings, knowledge about how to bring their development forward. For children with typical development, the right knowledge and the supportive social environment will usually be present. Of course, not always. You can also have children of who are impoverished in many different ways, but typically it will be present. But as soon as you have moderate or severe disabilities, you depend on a kind of sub-knowledge that are present in cultures, but only in subcultures. And you need to access this before you can actually know how to support a child with severe disability. Maybe it's, if an example could perhaps make it more clear. I did this research project in children with severe cerebral palsy, who due to their cerebral palsy had no verbal speech because of their physical impairment. Their brain is able to produce language, to understand language, but they cannot shape the words with that tongue and mouth, so they have to learn to communicate in a different way. It is quite a challenge to know how to support this communication with alternative or augmented communication. It calls for very specialized knowledge. And if this specialized knowledge is not present, then the child is hindered in its development. So it's
prompted to ask a sort of a personal question there, Louise, because I think I mentioned to you in a message that I grew up with a brother who was very severely disabled with cerebral palsy, and he never spoke a word in his life. And so as a young person, it was just sort of puzzle to me that if he never speaks, how much does he understand of what's been spoken around him, and how much, if you like, is going on in there? Now, I developed a kind of, as a child, a still waters flow deep kind of understanding, which I later came to see was probably somewhat with rose-tinted glasses. But does it mean that if someone is unable to speak, that they don't have language?
It depends, actually. There are several kinds of communicational disabilities. If we take autism, for example, there's like a third of people with autism do not have language, even though they actually have the ability to speak. So for them, we might assume that the language center in the brain somehow differs. They have difficulties understanding language, and they have difficulties producing it because of the language center in the brain. For children with cerebral palsy or people with cerebral palsy, Usually the language sensor in the brain is actually, it has potential to produce language. The problem is to produce the words. So usually they are actually very well equipped to understand language. And if they are given the right opportunity, they can also learn to produce language. But it is very difficult to find a technology that can actually support finding the words, having the vocabulary, accessing the vocabulary, and also how to operate. But if you find the right technology and learn to use it, you can actually learn how to produce language in amazing ways. I've come across in one of my research projects a young girl with severe cerebral palsy. She has no verbal language at all. She communicates with a gaze-controlled computer. You can gaze by fixing on the screen, and when you fix for enough time, it is like a mouse click. So you navigate by your gaze. And she has this computer for communicating with several stages, and she navigates it so quickly. Of course, not as quick as walk. She's good at communicating with these computers that she's now in university using this as a means of.
Amazing.
So it's amazing, but it shows the meeting in cerebral palsy of neuropsychology. You can, from a neuropsychological point of view, it's very clear that there are things one cannot do. Is hindered by hyperbiology. At the same time, a very vital point would be that culture, if it kind of builds higher mental functions, there's this way of potentials for culture participation through alternatives way. And she is just such a clear example of this. The way she used this computer is so automatically. She just navigates between all these many pages without thinking about it. She said, "Oh, I don't think about it. I just do it."
Which is what being a language user is exactly like, of course. Yeah.
Definitely.
Now, one of the things is that I think probably in all societies, certainly in all what we call Western societies, there's a very deeply ingrained ideology of independence. That being an adult means to be independent. Now, you've been a little bit critical about this idea and what it means for a disabled person. So could you explain to me a bit about how you see dependence and independence and interdependence, and specifically what it would mean for someone growing up with cerebral palsy to become an adult? How do they conceive adult life?
The thing is, at the moment in Denmark and in most Western society, we have a very strong societal value of inclusion. And this societal value is very much mirrored in all school practices, where inclusion is still a very strong value, and children are included. Of course, not unproblematically, but it's very clear they have a place in school. They ought to be there. It's a value that permeates all schools, the pupils in schools.
I'm a great fan of Danish movies, so it's impossible to watch Danish cinema and not be aware of the strength of this norm of inclusion. You're right, yes.
And as these children get young people, they have internalized this value, so they want to be part of society as well. And their parents too, they have also internalized this value and want the same for their young people as other parents want. They want to live a life of independence. They want to get an education. They want to get a job. And at the same time, it's very clear that they cannot gain independence, at least not if you have severe cerebral palsy. You cannot gain independence following the same developmental road as other children, because you are still dependent on somebody to take care of even basic needs. The societal value in the Danish society is also part of the legislation. So you actually have the right to get paid personal assistance round the clock if you have the ability to take care, to be an employer, to make a plan for how they are at work and put them to work. So part of becoming independent is actually to develop this skill. And the young people, they know this opportunity exists, and they are very much motivated towards this skill. So they have this general value position of gaining independence, and they are striving to it by developing this skill, and the parents are also supporting them in this skill.
Do parents commonly understand what independence means for their child? I mean, I find in Australia very common for parents to be looking after a child with some disability till they're facing old age themselves, and great concern what will happen to little Johnny when I go. So the ambition, if you like, for a disabled child to live independently or to live away from parents, which is generally how independence is interpreted, I think, nowadays. So do you have to put some effort into educating parents as well?
Yeah, but and often actually the professionals say, oh, the parents won't let the child go. It's like the parents are missing something.
Yes.
But I'm actually quite critical about this, because I understand why the parents find it difficult to let this responsibility go before they are actually sure that somebody else is taking over, either the young person, but often the young person are not able to take over this responsibility 100% by themselves. There has to be professionals who take over the responsibility, and often they only take it over kind of partly, perhaps not the way the young the parents want them to take it over, or not at the same level, or something is lacking. And then I understand why the parents actually have difficulties letting go, because they cannot be sure that everything is taken in hand by the professionals at the new place, not in the right way. There's a lot of criticism about how the level of service at this place where the young people go. So I understand why the parents have difficulties letting go. Oh, and now I got back to my point, why I was talking about this independence as interdependence is because if you look into the research on independence in adults with disabilities, it's mostly looked as something they have to take care of by themselves individually. And then they always come out as less independent compared to people with no disabilities. And it's a clear instance of ableism, where they are always compared to people who are able-bodied and seen as inferior. And I don't think that is fair, because coming from a cultural historical point of view, we are never individual in our lives. And we need to bring that point into understanding how independence can be reached also by people with severe disabilities, just in alternative ways.
Yeah, but I think the idea of I am independent is really invariably an illusion. It's a very cleverly formulated illusion that people think that they're doing it all themselves, but of course that's never the case. We don't live a moment without appropriate support, you know. And of course, if we're developing normally, we get that appropriate support. Now, I gather you're an academic. You work at the within the Department of Education, the Danish School of Education. Can you tell me the impact that you've had on the sector in Denmark? Because I mean, you're not in a home somewhere or in a school doing the education, so your work is mediated in a number of ways through others. So what impact have you been able to have on life for a disabled person in Denmark?
In Denmark, we have something called the National Board for Social Services, which is a kind of umbrella for all the municipalities. They can it's the responsibility for children and adults with disabilities belong in the municipality. But whenever they lack knowledge or expert knowledge about something, they can ask this national board. It's like an advice, and they developed a knowledge portal kind of for municipalities. And I'm often part of groups, or I come in and ask to participate in developing some of the knowledge portals whenever it come across line activities like communicational disabilities, children with disabilities, with cerebral palsy. Then I'm always asked to join some kind of group together with experts of different kinds.
You mentioned, for instance, you were already in your second year of your PhD before you'd even heard of the social cultural response. So I imagine, my guess is that in a lot of these situations, your fellows are people that don't have the same view of disability that you do. And is it a bit of a battle? And how does it work out in the end for disabled people? I mean, we've heard what you've said, and I think, my God, if you'd been around our family back in the 40s, things might have been different. But how does it work out? Do you feel like a lone voice, or are you making some getting changes in the general attitudes towards disability and education?
The thing is, when these groups get to usually both academics and its practitioners like physiotherapists, occupational therapists, they're actually often quite socially informed. They know that you cannot look at this child with cerebral palsy alone to address it. It is also part of how the social support organized by in Denmark. So interesting. It's not difficult in this social approach, along with perhaps a medical approach, which is also present. But it's not that difficult.
Yeah, I know that my partner had a stroke some time ago, and so I got a bit interested in the literature about that. But when I looked into this, you find that in fact the physiotherapists, they're sort of the paramedical staff, the people that actually deal with people after they come out of the operating room or somewhere where they've had some sort of neurological event, are perfectly well aware that people change and people recover from strokes. And yet there's a myth among the neuro people that once something happens in the brain, that's it, can't be fixed. And they sort of pass them off and maintain this myth of a brain that doesn't change. But among the physiotherapists and so on that were rehabilitating people, this myth never existed. Is that the case?
Actually, I has worked as a neuropsychologist at a stroke department, so I'm familiar with that line of thinking as well. I think both ideas are present. Regarding plasticity, there's a lot of difference between children, the plasticity of children, and the plasticity of adults like us. But just going into the stroke discussion, it's double, because first of all, there could be actual biological plasticity where the brain is able to come back from this event, because some areas have more like shut down than actually died. However, if they died, they will not come back at this age, or only very minorly. But still, people are able to find new ways of doing things. And I think that's what physiotherapists experience, that even though the area in the brain has died, people are still able to use new parts of their brain in new ways and actually come back quite far. Yeah.
And we're making progress, do you think?
Yeah. Definitely.
That's good. So when you're talking to your old colleagues who have been trained, came from the same place you came from originally, as that they're trained as medicals and with neurology, are they interested in your discovery that in fact the neurological view of the human condition is only part of the picture? Or, is it possible to win people away from the sort of brain-centric view of humanity?
I don't think you can win everybody back. Some people are very very dedicated to this brain-based idea. Yeah. Actually, also it's strong in pedagogy, and I think it's a shame actually that they, as soon as there is some kind of brain-based explanation involved, they stick to it very much, because it has this very strong positivistic value. Oh, we can see it's in the brain, and then it's better knowledge than saying something can be socially mediated in some ways. So I think you're right that it is still a difficult position to defend, or at times, because this biological view is so strong.
And it's not only strong, but it has a higher status, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely has, and it's a shame, because it has. I think I'm very much into neuropsychology, and I think neuropsychology can be very useful at times. But if you go into neuropsychology, if you don't have take the very simplistic way it is defended, if you actually dive into neuropsychology, then the current idea about neuropsychology is called neuroconstructivism. And the main idea of neuroconstructivism is that people are able to shape their brain themselves through their activity. And it's so open for a point of view from the cultural historical tradition. Like Vygotsky was open to, let's bring the natural line of development into this idea of how children develop. And neuroconstructivism is in the same way open towards, let's bring a social cultural idea into how people shape their own brains.
So there's an opening there.
Yeah.
There's an opening.
Definitely an opening.
How do you describe the relationship between the natural line of development and the cultural line of development? I mean, are these two different lines? Does one follow on after the other? What's the relationship between the natural line of development and the cultural line of development?
The natural, it's a very difficult question, definitely. The natural line of development, as I see it, is the biological potential of a particular individual. And the cultural line of development is, and it's actually very close to how Vygotsky expresses it, this is the cultural improvement of this biological potential. And usually for children, for people with typical disabilities, these two lines of development cannot be teased apart. This cultural improvement of the child's natural potential is just there, is automatically present in how the child's everyday life is organized. It is automatically supported. But as soon as your development is atypical, often you will need a specialized or adapted zone of proximal development to actually be able to use your potential. You need the presence of this special knowledge of how to support independence, or how to support development of communication by alternative means. It's not present, and you can actually be hindered in using your potential for example, developing language, if nobody is present who knows how to support your development of communication.
That's very, very sad, isn't it? Because that's, of course, the situation of millions of people around the world that don't have that access. Yeah.
No doubt about it.
Okay. Look, thank you very much, Louise.